Bonjour tout le monde. Alors c'est un plaisir de vous retrouver aujourd'hui sur une thématique critique qui est en fait la dimension du commerce international dans le contexte géopolitique que nous connaissons. Alors nous avons un panel exceptionnel avec une expertise sur les relations commerciales entre alors les États-Unis, la Chine, l'Europe, la Chine, l'Amérique latine, la Chine, et bien entendu les différentes dimensions de les enjeux commerciaux. Alors il faut savoir que la guerre, on parle vraiment de guerre commerciale, on dirait que le commerce en fait c'est une extension de l'influence et des moyens de faire la guerre entre différentes nations. On prend l'émergence de la Chine, c'était une des conséquences de tentative de division du camp communiste début des années 70. À ce moment-là, la Chine avait un PIB de l'ordre de 160 milliards de dollars. Et je pense que cette année, ils ont atteint 17 000 milliards de dollars. Donc, une petite ouverture. Un aperçu sur aussi les guerres. L'accession de la Chine au World Trade Organization date de 2001, au moment du 11 septembre. Donc, les États-Unis allaient être occupés avec les conséquences de la guerre contre le terrorisme et également les ressources pétrolières. Et à ce moment-là, la Chine avait les mains libres pour justement étendre non seulement son réseau commercial et sa puissance commerciale, mais aussi faire une transition sur les énergies renouvelables, duquel moi je suis personnellement impliqué depuis des années. Et on voit que nous sommes dans un monde en pleine transition. Ensuite, on a eu le Covid avec les chaînes d'approvisionnement et le risque que ça représentait d'avoir une Chine qui est l'usine du monde. Donc, à ce moment-là, les chaînes d'approvisionnement qui doivent être décentralisées. Et donc, c'est de cette manière que finalement, on voit actuellement aussi avec la guerre en Ukraine comment finalement le commerce et la guerre sont intimement liés. So, without further ado, I'd like to have your take. And I start with my speaker nearby on the U.S.-China trade prospects. How do you see? Actually, we feel like the world is between two bullies, and we are here in Africa, the global South, and we have Latin America on the panel, Europe, and we'd like to know, what can countries like ours do when confronted to such confrontation between two giants?
Oh, thank you. And I apologize that my French is terrible, so hopefully the translation is adequate. It's a difficult question to ask. What is the future of the U.S.-China relationship right now? We know what it was like under the first Trump administration, but that doesn't mean that it will be the same with the second Trump administration. The most recent statement from President-elect Trump is that he wants to put tariffs of 25% on Mexico and Canada, and then increase tariffs by 10% on China on his first day in office. So certainly I think we can expect that he is going to use tariffs as leverage to accomplish his economic goals and to support his economic goals domestically. And China will continue to be a country with which the United States has a great deal of friction, but it may be different from the first administration. Nonetheless, I think the trend of decoupling, the trend of the United States seeking to diversify its supply chains and become less reliant on China, and consequently, China doing the exact same thing, wanting to be less reliant on the United States and to diversify its trading partners much more. That trend is a long-term trend. It's already been in place for at least 8 years, and I think that we can expect that it will be in place for the foreseeable future. And so when thinking about what to do in your relationships with the United States and China, commercial relationships, I think this is a big part of why multilateral organizations have become more of an emphasis in international trade. And I think that seeking to take advantage of things like diversification of supply chains by inviting Chinese and US investment into other places is one of the things that can help create benefit from the tension.
So how consistent do you think the policy of saying, okay, we're going to apply trade tariffs with everybody goes against, we have a free trade agreement with the United States, and Europe is also in similar configurations. You mentioned North America. And so it almost challenges the very rationale of free trade agreements that have been negotiated to date. How do you see that dynamic of establishing economic alliances evolve when policy signals, at least before the elections, tend to threaten this approach? Yes, and I'm sorry, it's US related.
I think it's pretty clear, at least in the United States, that there has been a bipartisan turn away from an embrace of free trade principles. Both parties have become much more enthusiastic about protectionist measures and state intervention in the economy. And I think that is also a long-term trend. The very fact that President-elect Trump has told Mexico and Canada that he wants to put 25% tariffs on goods imported from those two countries on his first day in office, I think underscores this trend. These are, the most important trading partners for the United States. And the United States relies heavily on imports from both of them. And I think, the fact that is not something that President-elect Trump cares about protecting is significant. He's clearly positioning himself to renegotiate the US-Mexico-Canada agreement in 2026.
Okay, I know that there may be some disagreement with the incoming Secretary of Treasury, which says that basically trade tariffs are a good negotiating tool without going further beyond, and he did mention that he didn't really agree with that. So this is a story in the making. And I'm going to turn the mic to Carola on actually Europe and Morocco have also a free trade agreement. Do you see in Europe a trend in trying to yeah.
I wasn't paying attention because I thought you were talking to Carola.
That's right. I did mention your
but
name.
Carola
but
is there.
Okay.
Carola is there.
Sorry,
no, sorry. The name. There is a problem with names.
Paola. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Paola. My mistake. I'm sorry. I was referring to you, Paola, about the free trade agreements between Morocco and the EU in the ongoing context. Can those trade agreements be reviewed, like actually President Trump is implying in terms of North America? Can Europe then question again the free trade agreements it has reached with countries like Morocco, for example?
Well, let's say then the Europe, and we mean the EU, the European Union, is based on trade liberalization, and it's trade liberalization internally. So members of the European Union trade with each other, free trade, so no tariff. And then for the public of many young people here, then there is the other element of the European Union, which is the single market. So again, one market for where there is a free circulation of goods, capital, people, and services. So that is the idea of Europe. So obviously, the European Union has no intention to follow the the possible trade policy that will be implemented in the United States. Having said that, the European Union has a many free trade agreement with many countries in the world, including Morocco. Morocco was one of the first partners for the European Union for obvious reasons, because especially from here in Tangier, you can see that Europe is literally very, very close, and that there is obvious benefits in trading with each other. And we know there is a very intense trade between Morocco and the European Union, particularly in many companies in areas like textile, leatherware, but also industrial goods like cars. Now, the trade agreements have been reviewed several times because to take into account the evolving dynamics of the European and the Morocco, but generally the world economy. So, I'm not the one who set up the trade policy in the European Union, but I don't think there is any indications that there will be any change. And actually, there will probably deeper trade relations with the areas, the borders with the European Union.
Okay, we do have outstanding trade relations with the European Union and also with our neighbor Spain, where we share an automobile ecosystem that is thriving. And we can see the benefits of actually supply chains that can be shared. And in that context, I'd like to ask actually Carola on the EU. I mean, European Union is obviously expanding its trade relations with the Mercosur recently. And so what do you expect the strategy of the European Union to be in trying to reach out to other parts of the world, in trying to balance a little bit the US-China trade disputes?
Well, that's an interesting one. I don't expect much. That's the short answer. The European Union-Mercosur agreement has been on the making for 20 years. So it's all a little bit of cry wolf game now. It's every year we say, oh, well, by the end of the year, we'll have the deal signed, and it never happens. I think it goes, and it's beyond what's happening with China and the US and everything else. It got to a point where it just has to be with European Union environmental policy and whether Mercosur complies with certain issues or not. But let me go back to the big picture, which I think is probably more interesting than whether the Mercosur European Union is going to happen, because that'll be like trying to predict a very unknown future here. I think the European Union is at a moment where I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago in a meeting with several other think tanks around the world, and there was a lot of talk about the European Union. There's a lot of talk about how China is perceived as a big threat, and we don't like China. That's basically the not interline message, the direct message. And let's see what happens with the United States, and not a single word about Latin America, Southeast Asia, or Africa. And I think that says a lot to going back to the main title of this panel, the future of world trade. I think we are at a stage where we have to seriously think about the stability of the trading system as such in the future. We are all immersed in this geopolitical trade war, you name it, securitization of trade, nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, whatever shoring you want to think of. But at the end of the day, and the truth is that it's just the two big powers that are playing. And whoever's been involved in multilateral negotiations in the last couple of years, I used to be Undersecretary for Negotiations at Foreign Affairs, and when you're a G20, when you're a WTO, any negotiations, it all boils down to whatever the US and China want to do. And there's absolute no recognition that there's a different world, a world that is hoping to develop, to be taken into account. And I think that's the most worrying thing, to realize that the current architecture, financial architecture, commercial architecture, all the Bretton Woods institutions and the multilateralism we all, for the last couple of years, have saying, oh, is it working, is it transforming? Is only benefiting the architects of those institutions. And we all need to think very hard about what to do.
Okay, as you know, being from Morocco, I did mention an earlier example of, for example, having a supply chain for building wind turbines, and we had a blade manufacturer, a European blade manufacturer in Tangier that has set up a factory asking that there'd be a market of at least 1 gigawatt of wind, and they will set up the factory. So once this market was provided, the factory was set up, and once the market was delivered, the factory closed. A few months later, we have a Chinese operator who sets up a factory. Instead of 700 jobs, we're talking about 3,000 jobs, and doesn't even ask for a market locally because it's part of a regional supply chain. And so, as we mentioned, the elephant in the room, the question arises, and this question will be addressed to you, Niklas. what can China do to address the global South's preoccupation in trying to capture some of those supply chains in delivering a trade that can increase the value and the economic benefits for the countries that are concerned?
Well, I think China is already capturing all the supply chains, especially when it comes to green technology. In the case of Europe, we're fundamentally dependent on China when it comes to green development and green technology, and this is a concern. And I think the same would also be maybe for Africa and Morocco, when you have a domination of China coming in. And I belong to the much more critical, and I think we have to be realistic about this in China's role. Domination is always dangerous. So I think that what is important now when it comes to Africa and Morocco is not to be dependent on one supplier when it comes to supply chain. It's the diversification that is important. And I think and I hope Europe will be tougher on China and Chinese companies, not because China is particularly dangerous, but more because we should not depend on one supplier. China has weaponized its trade and supply chain, and as being a Swede, we have encountered this immensely. Lithuania has done similarly. So I think for Africa, it's important now when China moves in and promises very good deals to ensure that diversification is present. And also maybe, to be a bit realistic here, China's economy is running into deep problems. So the 3,000 jobs can very quickly be a Volkswagen solution down to zero again. So again, diversification.
So Volkswagen solution, I pick your lead on it. We have another example. I come up with examples in Morocco just to show you what we have recently witnessed. A Chinese factory of battery, a gigafactory is being built in Morocco. So this will enable all of our automobile sector to increase in local job contents and in technology, because we're in electromobility. And this is a huge $7 billion investment made by a Chinese company that is actually owned by Volkswagen, European company. And so what we are seeing here is a dynamic where actually European players uses China to set up a factory in Morocco to serve European markets. And this is why I'd like to address this question to Peter. How do you see actually the European Union's dynamic with China, where you realize you have, on one hand, the United States that starts to mentioning tariffs and questioning basic free trade agreements, and Europe, vulnerable already geopolitically, strategically, or almost defense with its problem with Russia and Ukraine war, relying heavily on US protection, and the dimension of hedging bets with China. And also, as we have Niklas from Sweden, we also realize that whenever you have a conflict with China, European Union tends to shy away to try to be supportive of every individual state in the European Union in conflicts with China. So what is the willingness actually of the European Union to have a consistent trade policy in trying to support individual member states of the EU and try to set up a union strategy to try to adjust to this unprecedented dynamic?
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. Well, the issue of weaponization and secularization has already been mentioned, and this is unfortunately for the moment a very dominant narrative inside the European Union. And in addition to that, Europe is undergoing a double transformation as we see it. It's the digitalization and the green transition. So European economies and the regulatory framework is very much under stress, and it has huge implications, of course, for our foreign relations. We have developed instruments in terms of anti-coercion, for example. Niklas already touched upon that issue. So I think from the side of the European Union, the framework is quite coherent. The problem is indeed the relationship between the Union and individual member states with their own interests. And of course, another issue, and you mentioned that already, is the system of trade relations we have established, or tried at least to establish. That's the problem if you have only one tool at hand. I mean, the European Union, with which you have full competences. Any other things are still very much nationalized. That means you put everything into the trade dimensions, and this often serves as a one-catch-all approach, leading to, well, unpleasant consequences in terms of, for example, Mercosur, where I fully agree that we will not see any substantial progress because majorities, political majorities in Europe have dramatically changed. So we see a wave of populism, of nationalism that is very much against the idea, also you mentioned, of a single market, of an open market. That was always the brand of the European Union. Unfortunately, we are rather moving away from that. And China is only one of the factors, by the way, who played into this issue. And of course, we cannot forget that we have two levels of conflict. It's the trade-related issues, which we might solve with established programs, but we have the systemic conflict on the top level. And unless we are not able to address it in a different way, we will not be able. And the weakening of international institutions have already been mentioned. That's the immediate result of this systemic conflict.
But we've seen actually Europe weakened even on trade issues. I did mention the issue with Sweden, but I can also mention the issue with, for example, Spain. When Algeria decided to cut gas flowing through Morocco to Spain, Europe did not move a finger, and we're talking about energy security. So you got sovereign dimensions within the EU, and you got the EU bloc not being able to negotiate or protect its interests.
This observation absolutely correct. There's a lot of frictions inside, and well, China is the other big example, and my own home country, Germany, is unfortunately the worst case in this respect. I don't see any change, unfortunately, in this kind of dynamic. Yes, we have, as I mentioned, created a bigger coherence, and the new Commission is absolutely crucial about, but as long as there is no real change also in internal mechanisms of decision-making, I am very much afraid that we will see this experience continuing.
So we can see, I guess, the light outside of the tunnel, because this represents some openings, actually, with respect to global commerce configurations. And I'll turn back to Anna about actually US foreign trade relations and the personality of the upcoming president, where we're talking about the deal maker. What is, you believe, in your mind, the margin of maneuvers of countries to try to negotiate some privy access to US trade in the configuration and in the particular personality of Donald Trump? Morocco is a good example of it. And I'd like to see how that can be used by, first of all, leveraged by Morocco and other countries alike. In other words, having countries that the US deems has strategic importance and is using them as a leverage in using also the trade opportunity for the US economy.
So, first of all, it's very difficult to predict exactly what will work with Donald Trump. Yes, he's a deal maker, and I think there's opportunity there because he's a deal maker. But everyone who says they know what he's going to do is lying, because the reality is that he intentionally creates situations where it's difficult to know what he's going to do. And he surrounds himself with advisors that have very different, in fact, conflicting opinions on things, including trade, as part of his strategy to make it difficult to predict what he's going to do. So let me preface my answer with that. That aside, I think there is a reality that the United States, although the United States does not want to be as dependent on China as it has been, and so there is a significant effort by White House administrations as well as by Congress to create policies that will force diversification of supply chains. It is impossible for the United States to be completely self-reliant in the near term, even if that is what they wanted to do. Imports are critical, and so one of the things that we've seen is manufacturing and processing of a whole variety of goods has moved out of China increasingly into third countries, but still with Chinese players involved in order to serve the US market, but also abide by the rule that it not be coming from China. I think that this is something that that African countries can try to take advantage of in terms of pushing China to provide the kind of infrastructure and investment in manufacturing that would allow African countries to move up the value chain, so that they're not simply providing commodities like critical minerals in their raw material form, but they're providing processed critical minerals.
And I believe this would serve US strategic interests in having a more inclusive trade and supporting the development of emerging nations in a global trade scheme. So I would hope that then those that have free trade agreements with the United States, like Morocco, won't be penalized if there is Chinese manufacturing in Morocco destined to the US market. So I'd like to address this question to Nicholas. How do you foresee China addressing its, trying to develop hybrid solutions to its confrontation to the US in its supply chain and in trying to project its trade lifeline in the future with the current administration, the upcoming administration in the US?
Well, I think actually the upcoming US administration is China's best solution. But of course, that forces a lot of us to rethink if the United States will now implement 20 or 30% tariffs on things. Can we afford to exclude China? Is China the alternative to the United States? I personally think that this is a short-sighted solution, but I think a lot of Europeans and other states will have to start considering China as an alternative. But I also see that China has, of course, they have strengthened their own domestic market to a large extent. They have built their own alliances, sort of smaller alliances like BRICS. The Belt and Road Initiative plays a role, but also bilateral agreements. So China has actually been preparing quite effectively for this. So from a Chinese point of view, this development might actually not be that terrible. And actually looking at the reactions internationally, China might actually be a winner coming out of this. Because let's be honest here, if United States closes for business, China will remain open. And especially also if Europe, as was pointing out, we're also closing a bit for our business. And we need to change that. I think that's a terrible development. But from China's point of view, this might actually not be terrible 4 years.
Okay, thank you. We see inroads of China into, I guess, a continent where the United States was largely dominating and was almost considering as its backyard region. And I'm referring to Xi Jinping's recent visit to Peru, where actually a major trade hub was inaugurated during this occasion, a stopover on the way to Lima, in the Canary Island on the way up, avoiding the Pacific, where China realizes it may be physically vulnerable in overflying an area that is dominated by the US. And on the way back, a stopover in Casablanca, a testing of actually, as both Canary Island and Morocco, we're talking about Morocco and Spain and China. And we can see also in the automobile sector, the Germans and the Spanish criticizing the European decision to put tariffs on EV imported from China. So how do you see the impact of China on the Latin American continent in the near future?
How many hours have I got? China over the last 20 years has become very important in Latin America, not only because China has been growing and demanding our raw materials, and we've been buying more important things from China, but also it happens at a time when the US clearly withdrew from the region, and with the pivot to Asia strategy and so on. And also within Latin America, we had governments that were more left-wing or more inclined to look at China. So all those factors together made a lot of room for China. And China has become a very solid, trustworthy partner of most countries in Latin America. Our relationship is structural. However, having said that, we are still navigating between the United States and China. And the worrisome thing is that we constantly feel the pressure of having to choose between one or the other. Having said that, there's only one side that makes claims when we get closer to the other side, and you can guess who that is. It's not China, definitely. But so, and this going back to the bigger picture again, because since I'm the only one from the global south in the panel, I'm obliged to say this. I don't think it's fair for developing countries to have to be choosing permanently between United States and China. They have this geopolitical war to see who's bigger, who's better, who's more modern. We just want to develop, and we don't want to be stuck in the middle having to choose between one and the other. And I think the only solution for that, and as mentioned in my previous intervention, is to have another good look at the international structure and international institutions. It can't be possible that still these days you go to WTO and there are negotiations pending, for instance, on agricultural issues that would help developing countries, and we keep bringing up new topics that are only for developing countries. I'm not saying, for instance, there's no need to talk about digital governance. It's fine, we need to talk about digital governance, but half of the world doesn't even have access to electricity or to digitalization. So it's again building new architecture that will only benefit the architects of that.
Definitely, architecture and also infrastructure, where China is obviously very much involved in the global south in building the needed infrastructure for improving the trades and the exchange of goods from the global south in the global south. And I'd like to address Paola. We have seen actually, you know, with the recent COVID crisis, the US raised significantly its interest rates, and back then the fear was, okay, the debt of the global south, the servicing of the debt will become unsustainable, and you know, you had lots of doomsday predictions. And then we realized that actually we live in another different world than in the 80s, because most of the trade, if you look at Africa, Morocco is the only country pretty much that has not China as its main trade partner on the balance. So that's also indicative of the rise of China in the global south. And the COVID crisis showed that actually the debt and the trade deficits were mostly with China, which could be dealt outside of dollar channels. So I know you are focused on also capital markets and the importance of debt. And how do you see actually this evolution of China into the global south, and actually the future of the dollar as an exchange currency and as a reserve currency?
Let me start to answer your last question. So the future of the dollar is actually dependent on trade, and the dollar is the currency that is used to invoice and settle international trade. So until the majority, and I'm talking about 80% of international trade is settled and invoiced in dollars, this is a known question. Now, let me go back to try to also frame our discussion in some way, like what is the importance of international trade? When we talk about free trade or low tariff trade, what is at stake? So just to clarify, countries can trade with each other with tariff. That hasn't, obviously tariffs create barriers and creates a lot of constraints. So the idea, which actually has been driven, if you like, the global economic order, as some of my international relation colleagues will call, since the end of the Second World War, is the idea that international trade can create benefits and can help countries to develop and to grow their economies. And the idea is that by removing tariff, so we trade zero tariff or with low tariffs, that means we create a more efficient system, we remove many of the costs, and we allow countries to integrate with each other. And so basically exploiting their best, where they're at best. So using their capacity to build and be able to expand in larger markets. So have not just the domestic market, but looking at larger markets. That is the idea behind international trade. So obviously there are costs and benefits. When Carola was talking about Mercosur and the EU, of course there are some industries that will be affected. So, for example, the Polish farmers are very much against this Mercosur agreement because they are the largest exporters of poultry in Europe. And obviously they don't want the competition from Mercosur. And obviously there are things. So now there are costs and benefits and costs. We know that internationally, over the last 30 years, countries actually got better. They, in particular developing countries, made big progress thanks to international trade. You mentioned the interest rates. Actually, up to 2022, we lived in a period of low prices. And one of the reasons prices were low, inflation was low, was because we could get access to goods that used to cost much more. Think about all the electronic goods. Think about a lot of low value goods like garments and designer fashion stuff. So this really is very important. A big element of this development was China. China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. It was a big thing at the time. Now, there is a big difference. At the time, China used to export low-value goods, Christmas trees to the United States. Now, I think President Trump doesn't have any objection to Christmas tree arriving from China into the US market. But then China developed as an economy, as a country and as an economy, and move up, as we say, on the value chain. Now China has very clear competitive advantages in telecommunication, fintech, all the green industry. It has the advantage of having invested in innovation, so being ahead of the innovation curve. It also has the advantage of having access to some critical raw materials that are critical for the development of what we call future industries, or not so future because they're already here. That poses a problem, in particular for the advanced economies, because now China is a competitor and a rival. And that's where we go down to the geopolitics for the international relations people, and not only for them, is now China poses a competitive in economic terms, but also is a rival in strategic terms in critical industries. And that's what is the problem we are facing now, right?
A systemic rival. And that begs the question to both the US and Europe on precisely Europe is developing CBAM mechanism, carbon adjustment border mechanisms, and the US environmental dimension on manufacturing is also being questioned by the upcoming administration. So before opening the floor to the audience, I'd like to have a take on, first of all, the United States. How do you foresee actually the environmental and sustainable dimension of manufacturing being integrated in the upcoming administration? And what is Europe likely to do in response? Because Europe has a policy of moving towards that direction. So Anna, the floor is yours, and Peter, you're next.
Well, President-elect Trump has said that he thinks that it is a waste of US resources to be investing in green energy technologies. He wants to focus on exploiting US oil and gas reserves. So I think that what we will see first and foremost is an effort to do more drilling and extraction of American oil and gas reserves and use that to boost the economy domestically. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of significant American companies that are not thinking in terms of just, the domestic economy and what President Trump President-elect Trump wants. They're thinking about being globally competitive, and that means that they have to do things like start to produce competitive electric vehicles. And so I think that that is going to continue to be a focus of the private sector, even if it is not a focus of the Trump administration.
Okay, so who's going to be the winner in the end? Those that manufacture sustainably, or those that exploit as much as possible the ongoing status quo?
Well, I think this train is set indeed in this transformation issue. There's no doubt on any political parties to leave. We have a discussion on regulatory issues. I think there's too much burden on European entrepreneurship. That is a big difference to the United States and even to China. I'm much more concerned first that we had not established enough channels of communication with the United States. There was not much progress over the last 5 years, for example. Now we are very much surprised that we have no partners to speak with. I'm much more concerned about issues such as CBAM, for example, this carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the supply chain regulations, which now come into terms. That might be totally contradictory also to the development options of your region here, for example. So we should invest much more in the upgrading of your economies to meet the standards, for example, before introducing these kinds of issues. Otherwise, we go back to a new era of protectionism, and that would be the worst. I can see, and Paolo, you mentioned this trap we are probably falling in Europe, what we call now mid-industry trap, and mid-income trap had been a long discussion. We have neither managed to go into this digital area fully and exploiting the advantages, nor have we the advantage of have low costs, for example. So we are really caught in a very unpleasant situation for the moment. I hope we will be able to break out of this cage.
Okay, there are also some leads, obviously, from the CBAM mechanism that the tax can actually be reinvested in the countries to manufacture more green.
But that was not communicated in the way it was put out simply, and now wherever I go, I see this point as the first, oh, you are closing your markets against intentions to open and to contribute to development.
Okay, because we in Morocco are welcoming these developments because it provides us with an opportunity to green our electricity production. Please.
Just to add to Peter, actually the European Union protects its market, right? The European Union is a free trade bloc for those who are members of the EU. Outside, obviously, protect its market for many different reasons. And obviously now there is this critical and strategic discussion about how can the European Union respond to the challenges that come in the new industries. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. It's not like the EU is just an open place for everybody. And a lot of countries are very aware of the trade policies of the European Union, as you know, Argentina is one of those.
Absolutely, and we see also...
The last thing is about China and the supply chain. Now, China has a big problem. China is a country, and you probably are aware, the economy is actually slowing down significantly. They face, and there is a very, very active and concerned debate in China about the current trade policies of the EU and the United States, because that affects the Chinese economic growth. And China now has an excess capacity. That means they produce more than they can absorb, but they can be absorbed by the external markets. That's why trade is so critical to China at the moment.
Yes, and the global south is likely to be the main market for Chinese goods. With those words, we have 15 minutes to questions to you. Please raise your hand and the microphone will come. So I have 2 questions in the front. Est-ce qu'on pourrait avoir un microphone devant, s'il vous plaît? And please try to be concise and ask a question to make sure we can address it.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank the panelists for their useful insights on the subject, but I would like to ask them if they see any role for BRICS in this general picture.
Okay, thank you very much. The role of BRICS, who would like to address this issue? BRICS, the role of BRICS.
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the biggest challenge for developing countries today is being torn between the US and China. I think BRICS is a good place, although when we talk about BRICS, BRICS plus, we don't know which BRICS we're talking about. I think if China is there, it's a bit more complicated because it doesn't represent these countries that are torn between one or the other. But I think it's a really good space where these countries can meet up. But more than BRICS, I think what the concept that's very interesting, that's been talked much about recently, is this of the swing state countries, similar to what the United States swing countries in elections. There are 6 countries that are sort of middle countries, and that they have been navigating this balance between the United States and China quite well. And those are Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, India, forgetting Saudi Arabia, and I'm forgetting one. I'll come back to it probably. And I think it's those countries and other countries as well that can actually make a big change, because we need when we talk about the global south is a very emotional phrase, but pragmatically at the end of the day doesn't mean anything, because we have so many, our voice is atomized. What we need in the global south countries is to have just one voice, and that's very, very difficult. But if we get the middle countries that have certain negotiating power, and they're seated at either BRICS, G20, or any place where we can make a difference, I think that that'll be the start of this transforming the multilateral institutions that I mentioned.
Okay, so I guess we can see populism as well in trade. We can see populism in trade alliances with the countries in the south that wish to express their disagreement with the way the world is run, and the rise of BRICS as an alternative to the status quo.
I don't think it's populism at all, actually. It's the reality.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's populism.
No, I meant, I meant to highlight the surprises we get in systems where obviously constituents, in the case of a country.
Even Argentina's president, who defines himself as a libertarian anarcho-capitalist, has mentioned this, which I not necessarily agree with a lot of things he says, but he stood up at the UN and mentioned that the multilateral system is not working, and he's definitely not a socialist, a populist. So.
Yeah, okay. We got the question in front. You still want to ask a question? Please raise your hand so that the microphone can come to you. Un microphone devant, s'il vous plaît.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Like,
okay, you will be next. Please go ahead.
Talking about economic alliances and like the American investments in Africa, can we expect that these investments will benefit both parties? When we talk about the re-election of Trump and his famous sayings, America first or make America great again. Thank you.
So what was the question precisely?
Will the American investments actually benefit both parties, Africa and the United States, with the re-election of Donald Trump? Okay,
so that is the question to Anna.
So I understand the fear there that you've got a leader who's talking about America first as if only America matters. But I think that at the end of the day, pragmatically speaking, every country is primarily concerned with its own interests, its own economy. So the question is not, is this leader going to be generous or not? Is this leader going to be amenable to cooperation, win-win cooperation or not? The question is, how do you leverage what that country's needs are to your benefit? And I think that's really the question that that countries in Africa have to think about in the context of their relationships, both with the United States and China and the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. Alors, the microphone in the front, please. Le micro, s'il vous plaît. On a besoin d'un micro devant. Et essayez de le passer. Bon, passez-le comme ça. Oui, on va passer par là. Prenez le micro et donnez-le à votre voisin, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Allez-y, je vous en prie.
Bonjour. Thank you. Trade wars and economic alliances, the future of global treaties. I think that Morocco has answered to this question. I think by the 6 November 2023, when the king announces this Atlantic African vision that engage Morocco. And it will be very profitable if we can receive from the panelists how they see it. This, we don't name it a trade war, but a trade alliance among these 23 Atlantic countries.
Okay, so it's basically the reaction of countries in the south to pull in regional blocks to try to share infrastructures and develop a block approach to trade. Who would like to address this issue? We have, for example, in Africa, many landlocked countries in the Sahel that need an access to the Atlantic. And so the idea that His Majesty came up with a year ago is to say, okay, we're going to have an Atlantic initiative that is also backed by other infrastructure projects ongoing in the energy and port sectors mostly, to try to open up new possibilities, essentially for landlocked countries. And I've had a panel on maritime sovereignty, and it's extremely well appreciated by the countries concerned. Who would like to address this question?
So maybe just a short thought on that. These are one of the projects Europe is totally blind on. We have very punctual interventions. We need energy, then we grab the next fruit, low-hanging fruit, but we hardly have an understanding how, for example, the idea of corridors can benefit also to us, be it energy, be it digital lines. We in Europe itself, ourselves have experience in corridor building and underinvested, by the way. So extending these ideas is a perfect issue. And these are fruits, indeed, which are ahead of our doors. Why not grabbing it? I will never understand why we are so blind on that.
Okay, great. Next question, please.
Thank you for your interventions. My question was actually about Africa, but it has already been taken. So I want to have a more global vision on why the geopolitical scene always have this bipolarity between China and USA. We hear this since Cold War, and it seems like Cold War never ended. And also, does Africa have the potential to have a place, an important place in this bipolarity? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Global war and China and Africa. I mean, we have to acknowledge that Africa's development and has been largely benefited from the rise of China. And I'd like you, Nicholas, to address this question.
Well, absolutely. Well, that connects actually to the regional trade agreement. So we do have the conflict between US-China, decoupling and conflict, but then we also see a multitude of unilaterals that is developing. And in Asia, we have RCEP, which is 15 economies going together. We see similar tendency. But then speaking of Africa as well, I mean, Africa is a big region. It's not a single Africa. It's extremely diverse. And I think it's important to hold that too, because there are parts of Africa that is more connected to Europe. There are parts of Africa that is more connected to China, and vice versa. So this is a very diverse region. But I do see quite a lot of potential, because we tend to focus on the geopolitical conflict between the US. We tend to look at the unilaterals that are forming. Europe has its own climate focus when it comes to trade. But then we also have network solutions. And I'm thinking about the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. It's also unilateral. And then India has also had its own sort of introvert development. So there are solutions that I think Africa could benefit immensely from. But then it's a question, which Africa? I don't think Africa as an entity, but I would definitely foresee a number of smaller solutions.
Unfortunately, the reality is China is the largest trading partner to all of African countries except of Morocco. So it's a reality that actually China has become the main trade partner.
But import or export, that's also a thing. This is a lot of countries in a negative.
Definitely, but that is to highlight the importance of China on the continent. Would you like to add something?
I would, thanks. I think that the point you raised about it feeling like the Cold War has never ended is an interesting one, and one that resonates with a lot of people. I would just say the major difference between this bipolarity that we are watching between the United States and China right now and the first Cold War, which was the United States and the Soviet Union, is that we have globalization now. We have this interconnected trading between countries all over the world that makes it far more complicated to try to actually create polarized parts of the world that don't interact with each other. It's almost unavoidable that even as the United States and China compete and see each other in adversarial terms, they're still going to be trading, and they're going to be trading with a lot of the same trading partners. And I think it's better to think about this moment in the world as not the rise of a new bipolar system, but a shift away from a hegemonic system to something new that has yet to be defined.
With those words, I'd like to conclude and giving you each about a minute time to talk about the leads of the future of trade. In 1 minute, each of you, what do you think are the interesting leads that could change the current status and that could project the world into more inclusive trade? I'll start with you, Paula, and we move up. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to start from that question. And I think one thing we should definitely do is to de-escalate the language and not talk about trade wars, but simply talking about competition among different systems. Because the reality is that China has a different system compared to Europe and the United States. China is not a market economy. It's a market economy with Chinese characteristics, or a capitalist system with Chinese characteristics, as you want to describe it. But the reality is there is some kind of incompatibility, which is not unsurmountable, between the two systems. And so we need to be aware of that. And we need to find a way to work together. That was possible 20 years ago, is more difficult now. And what we face is more fragmented world economy, which doesn't benefit anyone, and particularly is not good for the developing world, because again, as Carola said, the developing world doesn't want to be the standby, the innocent standbyers between the United States, China, United States, Europe, and China. So it's not a good place to be. But it's really de-escalating the language, understanding the reason for fragmentation, understanding the vulnerabilities that are behind international trade. So again, it's not like, as we thought 20 years ago, then everything was fantastic. There are sort of vulnerabilities in the sense we are vulnerable to disruption to supply chains. For example, for banal or simply incident somewhere that can disrupt the supply chain. We can have a shock like COVID that can disrupt the supply chain, or we might have difficult geopolitical, a difficult geopolitical environment that also disrupt international trade. So the idea is, and the future for trade is, first of all, to rethink the institutions, to rethink of some of the rules, and revamp the multilateralism in rules making and setting, as opposed to bilateral deals.
Okay, thank you. Peter, your take on it.
Well, 3 points. I think for the European Union, we have to be more pragmatic. We have to use unilateral issues. We have a tendency to seek very complex issues, very ambitious ones. I think this time is over. Sometimes a bit more humbleness cannot be harmed. Then we have to do a lot of homework in our own backyard. You mentioned the single market issue. That's a project for 70 years we have not finished. There's a lot of potential in economic growth and in linking other economies into this one. And the third is a lack of policy coordination. That we have trade policy. We talked a lot here on migration, which is a big issue for the region. Development policy. There are often lot of incoherences and contradictions. So clearing this policy field is one of the issues, and that is hard political work and sometimes art of politics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carola.
I think we have to understand that the multilateral system as we know it is not adequate for handling the realities, the non-hegemonic and this disruption in world markets. There are two main reasons. The world moves too fast and the institutions move too slowly, but also it's being completely inadequate to handle things like the pandemic, issues regarding developing countries, and more importantly, the rise of China. And that poses a serious question for developing countries. China grew in a way, and regardless of what China is or not is, spontaneous. They didn't need any help. It was with, I mean, I could spend 3 hours talking about the economic development of China. I won't, but China grew. China had the most rapid and most significant growth in human history that any country has had, with 700 million people lifted out of poverty on their own. And now they're a rival, now they're a challenge. Now, the question for us developing countries then is that, because we do need help to develop, is someone going to give us help? Because when you develop, if Africa, Latin America develop, we become rivals and challenges, then is it really true that the multilateral system is out there to help us all develop?
Absolutely. So sovereign policy, and thank God every country has the possibility to choose the policy it wishes. Nicholas, your take on it?
Well, I agree with Peter, but I'll take one thing: never waste a good crisis. And environment. And I think that this is where we can actually find more cooperative measures. That this is where this is basically an existential threat. This is something that will force us together. I also think the Americans will come around eventually, as long, half a joke, half truth. Whenever President Trump's golf course sinks in Florida, I think he will also realize it. But we need cooperative platforms that integrate environmental and social policies. And I think the climate crisis we stand in front of is actually something that triggered that. And that, as a European, I'm very happy that Europe at least is trying to lead on that front. Not saying we're doing a perfect job, but saying we at least are trying to do it.
Let's have Anna's take on this lead to conclude.
Well, I hope that the climate crisis will ultimately be a greater driver for US-China engagement than it is right now, because I think much of the world sees the climate crisis as the more obvious issue than any ideological differences between these two powers. But that aside, I think that we are at a moment where it's clear to everyone that the multilateral system as it has existed it's no longer working well. It's no longer nimble enough. It was never very nimble, and it has long failed to serve developing countries adequately. But now it's also not serving some of the great powers adequately. So we're going to have a move either to revamp it or away from it to blocks of trading partners, and that is an opportunity to create new rules and norms that are more representative of the interests of a broader group of countries.
Thank you very much. I tried the revamping group yesterday on a panel, and I realized that this was a no-go. Nobody wants to reform the structure that has been set in 1945 because everybody is everybody, the winners and those who control it don't want to give it up. So with those words, I'd like je tiens à vous remercier pour votre participation à ce panel, et je vous demanderai d'applaudir nos éminents panélistes, et je vous remercie pour votre présence.